In the center of the crush, the pressure was so immense that thousands died standing, held upright by the weight of the fallen. They never swung a sword. They never saw the enemy. Deep inside the pocket, panic turned to such absolute madness that veteran soldiers fell to their knees, clawed into the crimson mud, and buried their faces to find the only escape left. They chose the darkness of the earth over the terror of the weight. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, the wind blowing across the Apulian plain carried a taste of iron and dry earth, a sensation that felt less like weather and more like a warning. It was the Volturnus, a hot, relentless gale from the southeast that did not merely disturb the dust, but weaponized it, lifting the arid topsoil of southern Italy and driving it like ground glass into the faces of the marching legions. To the 80,000 men moving in a dense, rhythmic lockstep, the wind was an annoyance, a final indignity of a summer that had already taken too much from them. But they did not recognize it for what it truly was. They were marching into a corridor of air and geography that had been curated specifically for their arrival, a stage where the elements themselves had been conscripted into the enemy's ranks. The Roman column was a monstrosity of bronze and muscle, a formation deeper and heavier than anything the Republic had ever fielded, moving with the terrifying inertia of a landslide. They believed this density was their greatest protection, a wall of shields and bodies that no barbarian trickery could break. Yet it was this very closeness that marked them for destruction. The ground beneath their sandals, flat and seemingly open, offered a seductively perfect theater for their style of war, a place where sheer forward momentum could crush anything in its path. They did not see the river Aufidus winding to their right like a barrier, nor the broken hills to their left, natural walls that turned the open plain into a subtle, invisible funnel. The soldiers in the center of the formation could see nothing but the backs of the men in front of them, and the dust swirling overhead, creating a twilight of grit that obscured the sun. There was a strange, heavy energy in the ranks, a vibration that passed from shoulder to shoulder, not of fear, but of an impatience that bordered on madness. They were tired of chasing a ghost, tired of the scorched farms and the humiliations of the past 2 years, and this collective exhaustion had hardened into a single, brittle desire to end the war with one decisive collision. They tightened their grip on their pila, unaware that their formation was already too tight, that they had surrendered the ability to maneuver before a single sword was drawn. The air grew hot and thick, recycled by thousands of lungs, a precursor to the stifling pressure that awaited them. They marched with the confidence of predators, blind to the fact that they were stepping into a machine designed to turn their own mass into the instrument of their demise, guided by a logic that viewed their overwhelming numbers not as a strength, but as a fatal, uncorrectable flaw in the physics of survival. The strategy was not born of ignorance, but of a cold, mathematical rage that had been fermenting in the Roman psyche for 2 years. After the humiliations of Trebia and Trasimene, the Senate had discarded the nuance of maneuver for the brutal certainty of physics, concluding that the only way to defeat a genius was to present him with a problem that had no tactical solution, only a physical one. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. If the Roman army was a hammer, it should not try to be a scalpel. The consuls had ordered the maniples, typically arranged in a flexible checkerboard pattern to allow for rotation and breath, to compress themselves into a singular, crushing block of heavy infantry. By narrowing the frontage and drastically increasing the depth of the files, they transformed the legion from a tactical organism into a siege engine made of flesh and iron. To the men standing in those ranks, the tightness of the formation felt not like a trap, but like armor. The proximity of 80,000 shields created a sense of invincibility that silenced the instinct for self-preservation. There was no room for fear when there was no room to flinch, and as the advance began, the ground shook with the cadence of a machine that believed it could not be stopped. The sheer density of the Roman line was designed to absorb any shock and deliver a kinetic impact that would shatter the lighter, undisciplined ranks of Hannibal's coalition through pure momentum. When the two armies finally met, the collision confirmed every assumption the Roman command had made. The center of Hannibal's line, composed of Gallic and Spanish infantry, was bowed outward in a convex crescent, a thin ribbon of barbarian warriors that looked pathetically fragile against the depth of the Roman column. The initial impact was a release of tension that had been building for hours, a violent discharge of energy where the heavier Roman scutum smashed into the lighter oval shields of the Celts. The sound was deafening, a grinding roar of wood splitting and bronze deforming, but the result seemed immediate and decisive. Under the immense weight of the Roman push, the Carthaginian center did not hold. It began to give ground, stepping back foot by agonizing foot, unable to withstand the hydraulic pressure of the legionary advance. To the centurions leading the charge, this backward movement was the universal signal of a breaking enemy, the prelude to a rout where the opposing line snaps and the total collapse begins. They roared for their men to push harder, interpreting the yielding resistance as proof that their brute force strategy was working perfectly. The illusion of victory was absolute because the feedback loop of combat was validating the Roman error in real time. Every step the Celts took backward was a step the Romans took forward, driving them deeper into the enemy formation. The legionaries perceived this forward motion as success, unaware that they were trading space for survival. The compression within the ranks increased as they funneled toward the retreating center, the files instinctively closing in to maintain contact with the enemy, filling the void created by the failing Carthaginian line. This was the fatal mechanism of the trap, the Roman instinct to pursue, to maintain momentum, to close the gap, was being weaponized against them. The Gauls and Spaniards were not fleeing. They were performing one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare, a fighting retreat under extreme pressure, absorbing the Roman blow like a spring rather than a wall. They took the kinetic energy of the legion and used it to pull the Romans into a lethal pocket, their slow, grinding backward steps acting as the lure. Inside the Roman formation, the mood was one of savage, tunnel-visioned optimism. The dust rose in choking clouds, obscuring the wings of the battlefield, blinding the infantry to the wider, geometric reality unfolding around them. They could only see the enemy directly in front of them falling back, the glint of fear in the eyes of the Celts, the desperation of the barbarian defense. This visible weakness intoxicated the Roman ranks, overriding discipline with the hunger for a decisive end to the war. The soldiers in the rear ranks, unable to see the fighting, felt the forward surge and pressed into the backs of the men in front, adding their weight to the grinder, unknowingly locking the mechanism of the trap. They believed they were the reserves of a victory, pushing the spear point into the heart of the enemy army. The condensation of the files meant that individual soldiers could no longer rotate or swing their weapons freely, but this was deemed an acceptable cost for the overwhelming power of the push. They were a single body now, a massive projectile of bronze and will, driving itself deep into the soft underbelly of Hannibal's line. The geometry of the battlefield began to change imperceptibly. As the Carthaginian center bowed inward, transitioning from convex to concave, the Roman army was no longer fighting on a flat line, but was being swallowed by a half circle. The flanks of the Roman column, originally protected by their own cavalry in the width of the plain, were now brushing past the heavy African infantry stationed on Hannibal's wings. These elite units stood motionless, disciplined, and silent, watching the Roman mob thunder past them into the center. To a rational observer, the sight of fresh enemy troops on the flanks should have been a screaming alarm, but the Roman gaze was fixed forward, hypnotized by the retreating center. The logic of the push demanded total commitment. To stop or look sideways was to lose the momentum that was their only god. The deeper they went, the more the trap felt like a triumph. The air grew hotter, the press of bodies tighter. But in the heat of the advance, this constriction felt like the embrace of brotherhood, the reassuring solidity of the legion, closing its grip around the heart of a fading enemy. They did not know that the throat they were crushing was actually a mouth opening to swallow them whole, and that every inch of ground they gained was an inch of earth that would soon be shoveled over their heads. The first sign that the machinery of the battle had broken was not a scream or a rout, but a sudden, jarring change in viscosity. For hours, the Roman army had behaved like a fluid, pouring effortlessly into the concave vessel of the Carthaginian center. But now, deep within the afternoon, the flow began to stagnate. The sensation rippled backward from the front lines, like a shock wave through a suspended bridge. A stutter in the rhythm of the advance that forced thousands of men to stumble against the backs of those ahead of them. To the soldiers buried in the heart of the formation, this arrest of momentum was irritating rather than terrifying, interpreted as a momentary clog caused by the sheer volume of the combat taking place at the front. They cursed the delay, believing that the enemy was finally bunching up to die, creating a barricade of the fallen that simply needed to be climbed over. They did not realize that the resistance at the front had changed quality. The yielding, elastic defense of the Celts had been replaced by a rigid wall of fresh, unscathed, heavy infantry. The Roman command, blinded by the dust clouds that the Volturnus wind continued to whip into a brown fog, issued no orders to halt. Instead, the tribunes in the rear, seeing only the backs of their own men and assuming victory was inches away, ordered the rear ranks to push harder. This was the first fatal disconnect. The brain of the army was still commanding an advance, while the limbs had already hit an immovable object. The pressure inside the formation began to rise, shifting from the reassuring tightness of a shield wall to the uncomfortable intimacy of a crowd that has grown too large for its container. Space, which had been a tactical resource, was rapidly becoming a memory. Legionnaires found their elbows pinned to their ribs, their range of motion restricting with every shove from the rear. The warning signs were visible to anyone who looked to the periphery, but the tunnel vision of the assault had rendered the army partially blind. On the left and right flanks, the heavy African infantry, Hannibal's elite, who had stood like statues for hours, finally broke their stillness. They did not charge with a roar. They executed a precise, disciplined swing inward, a maneuver that looked more like the closing of a heavy gate than a military assault. Through the haze of grit and sweat, the Roman officers on the wings saw this movement but misinterpreted its geometry. They saw the enemy approaching and assumed it was a desperate attempt to flank a winning force, a reckless gesture by a crumbling army. They did not understand that these troops were not trying to fight them, but to contain them. The Romans tried to turn to face this new threat, but the density of their own ranks made the maneuver impossible. The maniples could not rotate. The checkerboard flexibility was gone, fused into a single, solid block of paralyzed muscle. Then came the sound from the rear, a low, thundering rumble that cut through the cacophony of the infantry clash. The Roman cavalry, which was supposed to be guarding the army's back, had vanished hours ago, chased off the field. The infantry assumed the returning hooves belonged to their own horsemen, coming back to share in the spoils of the victory. It was a comforting lie that persisted until the first spears struck the rear guard. The returning cavalry was Carthaginian, led by commanders who had finished their work in the distance and returned to seal the vessel. The encirclement was completing itself, not with a bang, but with the sickening mechanical click of a lock snapping shut. Yet even as the perimeter closed, the denial within the Roman ranks remained absolute. The men in the center still believed they were moving forward, interpreting the increasing crush as the necessary friction of a decisive blow. They felt the squeeze and told themselves it was the weight of their own power, not the walls of a prison contracting. The air grew hotter, stagnant and heavy with the smell of thousands of sweating bodies, but the panic had not yet set in. There was only a growing, confused frustration, a sense that the laws of physics were behaving incorrectly, that the ground was shrinking, and that the simple act of drawing a breath was becoming slightly, inexplicably harder. They were no longer an army marching to battle. They were a river that had flowed into a dam, and the water was beginning to rise. The legion ceased to be a tactical entity and became a geological feature, a calcified stratum of bronze and flesh, where the individual soldier was erased by the crushing weight of the collective. The discipline that had been drilled into them for generations, the rigid adherence to formation and rank, now conspired to destroy them. Centurions, wedged tight against their own men, screamed orders to open the ranks, to widen the files, but the commands were cruel abstractions in a space where physics had superseded authority. There was no room to widen anything. The scutum, the tall, curved shield that was the symbol of Roman invincibility, transformed into an instrument of constriction. Pressed flat against the chest of its bearer by the weight of the man behind and the resistance of the man ahead, the shield became a vice, pinning the rib cage and preventing the diaphragm from expanding. Men with healthy lungs began to starve for air simply because they could not create the inch of space required to draw a breath. The heat generated by 80,000 exerting bodies, trapped under the August sun and insulated by armor, caused the temperature within the pocket to spike to levels incompatible with endurance. It was a wet, heavy heat that did not radiate away, but recycled itself, growing more toxic with every shared exhalation. The paralysis was total and terrifyingly slow. A soldier in the third rank might see a Carthaginian spear reach over the shoulder of the man in front of him, but he could not raise his own arm to deflect it. His sword arm was pinned to his side by the pressure of his neighbor's body, rendering him a statue in iron, armed but harmless, waiting for the inevitable end to reach him. The concept of bravery became irrelevant because bravery requires action, and action had become impossible. The legionaries were no longer fighting. They were merely occupying space, providing the friction that kept the trap tight. The ground beneath them turned into a slurry of dust, sweat, and mire, forcing men to struggle for footing even as they were held aloft by the crush. When a man's legs finally gave out from exhaustion or terror, he did not fall. The density of the crowd held him upright, suspended in a macabre standing coma, his dead weight adding to the burden of the living men on either side. The auditory landscape shifted from the sharp, metallic ring of combat to a dull, muffled roar, like the sound of blood rushing in one's own ears. This was the sound of compression, the groaning of leather, the creaking of compressed armor, and the desperate, shallow gasps of thousands of men realizing simultaneously that they were entombed in open air. The logical mind tried to reject the reality. The Roman military machine was designed to solve any problem through discipline, but discipline required order, and here there was only a solidified chaos. The feedback loop of the trap had reached its terminal velocity. The outer ranks, terrified by the encircling Carthaginians, pushed inward to escape the blades, transmitting that force through the conductive medium of the mass until it crushed the life out of the center. The system was still working. The men were staying in formation. They were facing front. They were holding their shields. But the context had inverted, turning their obedience into a fatal paradox. They were a singular organism that had forgotten how to breathe, a leviathan stroking out in the sun, its extremities being sheared away while its heart exploded from the pressure of its own blood. The battle had long since ceased to be a contest of arms and had devolved into a grim form of manual labor. On the edges of the contracting circle, the Carthaginian infantry worked with the repetitive, dead-eyed rhythm of harvest laborers, swinging their weapons not with martial flair, but with the grim economy of men clearing thick brush. There was no need for parrying or feinting because the Roman wall facing them was paralyzed, a dense mass that could not strike back. The combat became a matter of pure endurance for the victors. Their arms grew heavy, their blades dulled on bone and bronze, and they had to rotate shifts, stepping back to drink water and sharpen their iron while fresh comrades stepped in to continue the work. For the Romans on the periphery, the end was immediate and merciful, a sudden darkness amidst the chaos. But for the thousands trapped in the interior, the horror was a slow, creeping realization of their own irrelevance. They were no longer soldiers, but trapped figures in a holding pen that was slowly shrinking, defined by a geometry of inevitable demise. The noise of the battlefield had distilled into a rhythmic, wet thudding, a sound that grew louder with every passing minute as the layers of men between them and the edge were peeled away. Inside the crush, the vaunted Roman discipline had metastasized into a mechanism of self-defeat. The instinct to hold the line, drilled into them since youth, now served only to keep them in place for the end. If they had been a disorganized mob, they might have scattered, trampled one another in a chaotic surge that allowed a few to escape. But they were Romans. They stood their ground even when the ground was nothing but a slurry of their kinsmen, maintaining the formation that had become their trap. Officers with no one to command stood shoulder to shoulder with raw recruits, stripped of rank by the equalizer of the press. There was no strategy left to discuss, no orders to give other than the silent, collective command to stand until the end. The dust that had blinded them in the morning had settled into a thick paste on their skin, mixed with the sweat of panic, sealing their pores and accelerating the heat stroke that claimed men long before the swords could reach them. They fell from thirst while standing in a crimson mire. They faded from lack of air while under the open sky. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the psychological dam broke long before the physical one. The waiting became a torment more exquisite than the combat itself. Men could calculate their remaining time by the proximity of the screams, counting the rows of backs in front of them like sands in an hourglass. When the mind could no longer process the terror of the approaching edge, it snapped inward. In the center of the pocket, where the pressure was greatest and the air most foul, veterans of previous wars began to perform the only act of agency left to them. Unable to draw their swords, unable to fall, and unable to scream, they dropped to their knees, forcing themselves down into the mud between the legs of their comrades. There, in the dark, stifling undercurrent of the press, they clawed at the earth with their bare hands, digging shallow, desperate basins. They did not dig to escape. They dug to find peace on their own terms. They plunged their faces into the soil, inhaling the dirt deep into their lungs, choosing the gritty silence of the earth over the agonizing passive wait for the Carthaginian blade. It was a mass surrender of the spirit, a rejection of the visual world that had become too terrible to witness. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the plain, but the work was not finished. The mound of the fallen around the perimeter grew so high that the Carthaginians had to climb atop the dead to reach the living, fighting from a rampart built of Roman bodies. The enclosure was now a pit, a sunken theater of misery where the floor was composed of the lost. Yet even in these final hours, the machine did not stop. The Roman organism, broken and limbless, continued to pulse with the spasms of the dying, the involuntary twitches of a beast that does not know it is already a ruin. There were no more prayers to Mars, no more cries for the Republic, only the mechanical sound of the strike and the silence of the void filling the space where an army used to be. The system of the legion, designed to dominate the world through order, had achieved its final, perfect form. A solid block of humanity, so disciplined that it allowed itself to be erased from history, one man at a time, without breaking rank. When the sun finally retreated below the horizon, it did not bring darkness but a gray, monochrome revelation of what had been done. The screaming had stopped hours ago, replaced by a silence so profound and heavy that it pressed against the eardrums of the survivors with more force than the battle itself. The wind, the same Volturnus that had blinded the Romans in the morning, now blew cold over a landscape that had been terraformed by violence. The plain of Cannae was no longer a flat stretch of Apulian farmland. It was a raised plateau of human remains, a topography of ruin and iron that stretched for miles. The victors, men who had spent the entire day cutting through the ranks, did not cheer. They moved through the twilight like ghosts, stepping tentatively upon a carpet of the dead because there was no bare ground left to walk on. They were too exhausted for triumph, their arms swollen and trembling from the repetitive motion of the combat, their minds numbed by the sheer industrial scale of their own efficiency. They wandered the field with torches, not as warriors but as ghastly custodians of a graveyard they had built with their own hands, looking for loot in a sea of faces that all wore the same expression of final, stifling terror. The looting was not an act of greed, but of grim archaeology. To retrieve a breastplate or a sword, a Carthaginian soldier often had to dismantle a puzzle of the fallen, pulling apart men who had died in a desperate, frozen embrace. As they peeled back the layers of the dead, they uncovered the true story of the final hour. They found Roman legionaries who had not a single wound on their bodies, men who had died simply because their chests could not expand against the pressure of the crush. They found soldiers who had clenched their jaws in the agony of the weight. And deep in the center, near where the heart of the Roman formation had once beaten, they found the men who had buried their faces in the dirt. These figures were discovered kneeling, their heads submerged in the crimson mud, their hands still clutching the earth they had used to escape the horror of the light. It was a sight that silenced even the hardened mercenaries of Hannibal's army, a testament to a level of psychological pressure that transcended the natural fear of death. The Romans had not just been defeated, they had been broken into something less than human before they were allowed to die. The true measurement of the catastrophe, however, was not found in the pile of bodies, but in a small, growing mountain of gold. Hannibal's officers had ordered the collection of rings. Every Roman knight, every senator, and every noble who lay dead on the field wore a gold ring as a sign of his rank and status. As the night wore on, the soldiers brought these rings by the handful, stripping the jewelry from the stiffening fingers of the Republic's best men. They were thrown into a pile that grew obscenely large, a shimmering heap of wealth that represented the severing of a civilization. This was not merely plunder, it was a census of the dead. 3 bushels of gold rings. That was the final tally. Each ring represented a family, a lineage, a seat in the Senate, a commander of men. In one afternoon, Hannibal had not just destroyed an army, he had erased the governing class of Rome. He had surgically removed the brain of the Republic, leaving the body paralyzingly alive but headless. The officers staring at that pile of gold understood that they were looking at something that had never happened before and might never happen again. The complete mathematical deletion of a superpower's leadership in a single solar day. As the moon rose over the carnage, the magnitude of the silence solidified the event into history. There were no messengers riding to Rome to report a setback. There was no one left to report. The 80,000 men who had marched out with the rhythmic thud of confident predators were now just texture on the landscape, food for the wolves and crows that were already gathering in the darkness. The Roman Republic would survive, it would rebuild, and eventually it would conquer the world. But the Rome that existed before this sunrise was dead forever. The confidence, the belief in the simple arithmetic of superior numbers, the arrogant faith that order always triumphs over chaos, all of it lay buried in the mud of Cannae. The wind howled over the dead, carrying the copper scent of the field of death toward the city that was now waiting for an end that felt inevitable. The battle was over, the trap was empty, and the only thing that remained was the terrifying truth that a civilization can be ended, not by a long war, but by a single afternoon where the geometry of fear is drawn correctly.